Amen. Okay, just as a very brief recap of some of what we talked about on Wednesday, and we'll not go in nearly the detail that we did on Wednesday about the roots of Calvinism and how Calvinism uses Romans chapter 9. But just to say, Romans 9 is not about this. You have one individual, we'll call him Steve, no reason for that use of a name. And Steve has been elected to salvation. You have another individual by the name of Eric, again, no significance to the use of the name. And Eric has been elected to damnation. That is the typical Calvinist approach to Romans chapter 9. Here is what they say it is teaching. Well, as we stated on Wednesday, that ignores a whole lot of things. Regardless, first it ignores the rest of the context of Scripture, but it ignores the context of Romans to begin with. Romans is not talking about how God chose different individuals to salvation. Romans is talking about how God has chosen from all groups, that all groups can be a part of the saved. So that's really what we're dealing with. There is the matter of spiritual Israel, and there's the matter of physical Israel. And as we're going to look at the conclusion of the chapter this morning, spiritual Israel is righteous through faith. Physical Israel is unrighteous through law. That is what is the distinction in this chapter. I want you to note something, though, because we'll get here on Wednesday when we start chapter 10. Remember that chapter 9 begins with Paul expressing what's on his heart, his feelings. So he says in verse 2, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. And he goes on to talk about how he wished he could be cut off for the sake of his kinsmen in the flesh. So that is the source of his sorrow. It is physical Israel. It is the nation of Israel. They are separate from Christ by and large, and Paul has great sorrow over this. You go to chapter 10 and verse 1, and Paul kind of takes up on that thought again. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. So in both chapters, Paul begins by talking about his feelings for Israel, his desire for Israel. And so what I take it is that verse 6 through 33 of chapter 9 is really kind of an excursus. It's dealing with, well, what happened here? You know, why are you so sorrowful? How are we going to get back to, that they could be saved? So this is not really the main point that Paul is trying to get across. This is more of a side point. All right, let me explain to you why I am so sorrowful and what has happened to my people, and then we'll get back to the main point of how Israel can be saved. That's what we're dealing with in this passage. Now, already we covered on Wednesday a couple of examples of election or choosing. And so you've got two sons of Abraham. There is Isaac, chosen by promise, and there is Ishmael, who is not selected, not chosen. Now, it does not say anything derogatory or negative about Ishmael. It just makes the point that it was Isaac who was chosen. He was the son of promise. Then you have Jacob, who is also chosen by promise, and there is Esau. Now, there is the quotation taken out of Malachi about how Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. But as we even talked about on Wednesday evening, that quotation is from over 1,000 years after the actual lives of Jacob and Esau, and is actually describing the nations. How Israel was loved by God, by the way, even though they didn't deserve it. But Esau, because of Edom's constant rejection of God and constant violation of His will, are quote-unquote hated by God. But what Paul is saying is, to his physical brethren, God has chosen our people throughout time. He chose Isaac. He chose Jacob. He selected Israel, but for what reason? Does anybody remember what we looked at, particularly in verse 5? What was the ultimate reason for Israel being chosen by God? Who would come from them? To them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever. This is why Israel has been selected. Christ, God in the flesh, would come from them. Okay? That's the election, that's the choosing that Paul is talking about so far in Romans chapter 9. Now we're going to start afresh in verse 14, but before we get there, any questions, comments that anybody has so far? All right. Well, going into verse 14, here is perhaps one of the, at least historically, thornier passages, trickier passages, which has to do with Israel and Pharaoh. So let's go ahead and start looking at the text, verse 14. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? Why would you think Paul raises this rhetorical question? Is God being unjust? Well, here's what I think he's getting at. God, as Paul has just demonstrated, has chosen the Israelite nation over time. Chose Isaac, chose Jacob, he's chosen Israel. But remember, how did Paul begin this passage? I am sorrowful for them. How can God choose Israel and yet Israel stand not saved? That doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem fair. How could God choose someone and then not save them? I think, anyway, that is what Paul is addressing starting in verse 14. So he asks the question, is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. Okay, let's deal with that quotation first. He says this to Moses. Who has where that quotation is found? Exodus 33. Exodus 33, ring any bell? What's going on within the nation of Israel when we come to Exodus chapter 33? Aftermath of the golden calf. Golden calf is Exodus 32. And what did God say He was going to do in Exodus 33? Yeah, let's just start over here. Let's start over with Moses. And there's a couple of threats that God makes. There's that threat. There's a threat. Okay, I'm going to let the people go, but I'm not going to go with them. And I'll send an angel. And Moses is distressed by that. No, we have to have the Lord go with us. So there's this role of Moses as intercessor for the people, but the people they stand condemned. They are deserving of God's wrath. And what does God give them? He gives them mercy. That is the impact of what Paul is dealing with here. Paul is saying to his people, look, our people in our history deserved wrath. But God was merciful to us. And why? He doesn't state this in the text yet anyway, he's getting there. Why was God merciful to Israel? He chose them, and He chose them ultimately for what, Ross? Okay, the Messiah is supposed to come through them. The one who's going to bless all families of the earth is supposed to come through them. So they're chosen, they deserve wrath, but God gives them mercy. Okay? So then you move on. Well, he kind of recaps this. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. Apply that to what I just said about Israel. Where did human will and exertion get Israel? Not very far. Their own will, their own exertion got them condemned. But God was merciful to them. Okay? Then you move to Pharaoh, verse 17. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." Okay, that's really, it's the aspect about Pharaoh that trips people up more than anything. So let's talk about that for just a few moments. How many husbands are in the audience? Okay, a lot of hands being raised. Do you know how to harden your wife? You absolutely know. Oh, shut up, Kenny. He wasn't actually talking, but he's. If you're a husband, you know how to harden your wife. You know exactly the words to say or the actions to take to harden her toward you. Parents, you know how to harden your kids. You know exactly the words to say, the actions to take to make them upset and quote-unquote harden toward you. Does that take away their responsibility in that? No. I think we need to think about what God does with Pharaoh in kind of the same way. People look at this, and those who favor an individual election, they look at this and say, see, Pharaoh had no option. Pharaoh had no choice. It's almost like treating Pharaoh like he was some godly person that God just had it out for and hardened his heart. Well, that is not Pharaoh. That is not the individual that you are dealing with in the book of Exodus. In fact, go back, look with me at Exodus chapter 5. The quotation about Pharaoh, and we'll talk about the importance of that here in just a minute, is from Exodus chapter 9. But you go back to Exodus chapter 5, and notice what is given to Pharaoh, the option, the command that's given to Pharaoh when God first gives him his instruction. So Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Okay? And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." What I'm submitting to you is that the command that God gave to Pharaoh is a tailor-made command to harden Pharaoh's heart. Why is that?
First, you've got someone that they are presenting that would be asserting authority over Pharaoh, which if you feel like you're kind of the leader of the free world or your world, you're not going to take that very well.
Right.
There should be nobody that challenges authority.
Who are you telling me what I need to do? And even take that one step further. Pharaoh not only viewed himself as the leader of his world, what else did he view himself as? God. He is God in his world. And who is the Lord? Who is this? Does Pharaoh not have a choice in this? Of course he does. But God hardened his heart. He gave him the command that Pharaoh was never going to follow. Yeah, Kenny?
God also chose a spokesman that Pharaoh would have known.
True.
And somebody who was rebellious to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And who was a convict to Pharaoh as well. I mean, I think you're exactly right. Pharaoh knew, God knew Pharaoh's heart and asked him to, I need you to sanction a worship event that has nothing to do with your power and authority. As a matter of fact, it undermines your power and authority. So,
Yeah.
this is the way I think you're right.
I agree with that. And well, actually, I appreciate you bringing that up because I hadn't actually thought of that. But just using Moses as someone who, from Pharaoh's past history, you would have known, I think also makes a good point. Zach, I know you just taught Exodus. Remind me, I think I'm correct in this. The number of times Exodus says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, is it equal with the amount of times that it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? Okay. So you've got, both are said. So what I think we ought to take from this is it is not removing responsibility from Pharaoh. He still had choice. However, we don't need to diminish it either. God is doing this for a reason. And that's what Paul is saying. God used Israel for a reason. He used Israel to bring the Messiah into the world. What was his purpose with Pharaoh? It says it right there in the quotation. I am going to show my power, and I'm going to bring glory to my name with this individual. So you think about it, you've got these two. You've got Israel, you've got Pharaoh. Both are chosen to serve the purposes of God in one way or another. Again, Israel is chosen to bring the Messiah into the world. Pharaoh is chosen to extol the power and the glory of God. Israel received undeserved mercy because that was how God was going to bring about his purpose in Israel. Israel deserves wrath with the golden calf. God gives them mercy. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and deservedly so. Pharaoh is punished, and justly so. And that also is for the matter of bringing about God's purpose. Here is how God's power is going to be extolled and his name was going to be glorified. Ross, then Mike.
It almost seems like in this example and in other examples, like us humans are stuck in time, like we see cause and effect. And so what it feels like, what you're talking about is, well, that's unfair. God, just set Pharaoh up just to fail. But what you're talking about is because God knows all, it's like he knows who to choose that already is failing, and he can bring about the best good out of that bad situation anyway. It's like God, it's not a cause and effect. God knows what to do with what has already happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a lot of our questions, I think Ross is right, because we're looking at it and trying to judge God's actions based on where we are. You can't do that. How did that go with the prophets when they would question God and why? How could God use Babylon? How could God use an ungodly and wicked nation like that to punish his people? Well, God knows exactly why he's going to use Babylon, and he knows exactly when he's going to bring punishment on Babylon too. Mike?
Well, we notice that God has a great interest in this particular event in the Old Testament. He says over and over again, I am the God who brought Israel out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And this was a very important thing to God, and he said it many times in the Old Testament. So when we read here that he shows his power, this was important to God.
Absolutely.
Probably could be said the most important event of all the history of Israel.
This event, I agree with Mike, is you cannot de-emphasize how important this event was in God's history with Israel. This is what's supposed to have impressed upon them. I'm God. I'm your Savior. Gary?
This may be completely out of context right now, but we're using the word chosen and choosing a lot here, and we're talking about Israel being chosen. And I'm going back to a really good podcast that you and Kenny had not too long ago. And
Did you hear that?
did I remember distinctly?
I know.
And you guys both made the point, and it resonated with me, and I hope maybe you can address it here, that really God did not choose Israel, he chose Abraham. And I don't know if that's out of context here to ask that question.
Yeah. Boy, I may have said that just because it sounded really good. Don't know that biblically that holds up. There's definitely, he chose Abraham based on Abraham's faith, I would say. He chooses Israel as well, but it's not based on Israel's faith, it's based on the promise that he made to Abraham. That would be the differentiation there. Because he chose Abraham, and through Abraham, he's going to ultimately bring the Messiah. Therefore, he chooses Israel, but as we see, Israel does not share in the faith of the patriarch. Yeah, Steve?
It's all providential. If you look to describe providence, you go to Acts 24, where it says that Felix had a purpose which was peace and prosperity for the nation, and he used
Right.
So all those people were players, but God was using them to bring his son to the cross.
Right.
He didn't make them evil. Caiaphas said it's expedient that one man die for the nation. That was his purpose.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing here, that God's purpose is to bring his son through the lineage of Abraham, through Israel, to save the world.
Yeah.
And at any time, Pharaoh could have said, take off, guys.
Right. Absolutely. We're going to build on what Steve just said here about, again, his ultimate purpose in choosing Israel. We'll go ahead and go into the next portion of text here. Okay? So, Paul again raises a rhetorical objection. You'll say to me then, why does he still find fault, for who can resist his will? I think first off, if you take what Paul is using as a rhetorical question in verse 19 and say, okay, this is gospel truth, you're missing the point. Who can resist his will? Plenty of people. People throughout history have resisted his will. And so Paul is not laying down some new truth that no one can possibly resist the will of God. No, he's using this as a rhetorical device. He's asking, looking at it from the perspective of national Israel and saying, well, he chose us. He wants us to serve him. And so, are we really responsible here? Why is he finding fault with us when he's the one that chose us? All right, so then Paul goes on to say in verse 20, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Well, what is molded, say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? I'll pause there for a second. This is, as we mentioned on Wednesday, this is the proof text, if you will, that many may give you if you were to say, well, wait a second, I don't agree with your theology of individual election because that would make God a respecter of persons. That would seem to contradict John 3:16, that God so loves the world, and 2 Peter 3:9, that God does not desire the destruction of any, he desires the salvation of all. And so they may say, well, who are you? How are you answering back to your maker? Don't question would be the response. And this is the passage that they would use. Again, taken out of context, though. It's interesting, Jeremiah 18 is probably the imagery that Paul harkens back to, where Jeremiah is instructed to go down to the potter's house and he witnesses there, a potter taking a lump of clay and he can mold it what he wants. But interestingly, in Jeremiah 18, God's message to the prophet is this. Look, I'm making this, and I am determining destruction. But if a nation repents, I'm going to relent from my destruction. They have a choice here. I can still make them into something useful. And vice versa. If I have a nation that I'm making into something, but then they reject me, I can destroy them. Well, Paul's point here, I think, is really cleared up when you let him define, well, who are these objects of wrath and who are the objects of mercy? So skip down, verse 23 and 24 defines for you who the objects of mercy are. In order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. Paul right here has brought it back to his thesis throughout the letter. Who is the gospel for? It is for Jew and Gentile. Who is salvation for? It is for Jew and Gentile. What has God prepared beforehand? That there would be vessels of mercy. And guess where they're coming from? They're coming from Jew and Gentile. It's all a matter of how, no matter what group you belong to, Jew or Gentile, you can be a part of the objects of mercy. Kenny?
The other thing that I would say is when you look at this vessel that has honorable This
Yeah.
is not their God.
Absolutely. And let's go further, because this is what Paul does here. And again, this all makes sense when you read it in this context. So let's look at these vessels of wrath. And it says of them in verse 22, what if God, desiring to show his wrath and make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? That is national Israel, and it fits right in the context. Again, what did national Israel deserve? Destruction. And yet God had shown them mercy. That was his whole point with the Pharaoh and Moses contrast. He had extended mercy to Israel. Why? Because from them were going to come these vessels of mercy. Through Israel was going to come the Messiah, and then Jew and Gentile could be saved. They could be objects of God's mercy. And God said right here, I wanted to destroy them. You know, they deserve this, but I was merciful to them. So again, this is the matter of election in Romans 9. You have spiritual Israel, they are the vessels of mercy. You have physical Israel, they are the vessels of wrath. They deserved destruction. And by the way, destruction was quickly coming upon the Israelite nation. It would only be a few years after Paul wrote this letter to the Romans that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, and the end of the Israelite nation as it was understood at that time would take effect. God's wrath was coming. Jesus spoke of this numerous times, even in his own ministry, about how God's wrath was coming upon physical Israel. But God had relented in that until the vessels of mercy, Jew and Gentile, spiritual Israel, were brought forth. All right. He then goes on, uses quotations in verses 25 through 29, using both Hosea and Isaiah to talk about this matter that God is bringing in those who were not formerly his people. And it's interesting, Hosea, the quotation there, Paul seems to be using it as the bringing in of the Gentiles. And the point being, these were not my people, now they are my people. They didn't deserve it. The Gentiles didn't deserve to become God's people, but now they are. It's because God's merciful. And then he uses Isaiah to talk about how a remnant was going to be saved of Israel. Again, not deserved. Israel didn't deserve a remnant, but God is merciful. So that's why the spiritual Israel are the vessels of mercy. God bringing in, whether they be Gentile or Jew, they are benefiting from the mercy of God. And so you come full circle in verses 30 through 33 to what is the determining factor here. And it's, I think, significant again. In a chapter dealing with election, a chapter which, again, has been perverted to speak of unconditional election of individuals, there's still this qualifier spoken of in this chapter. What then shall we say? Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is, a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because it did not pursue it by faith. But as it were, based on works, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Throughout Romans, Paul has made this point. Justification, righteousness, God's promise is found through faith. And now he is saying that's what these objects of mercy they've received. Spiritual Israel, because they pursued righteousness by faith, they are receiving mercy. Physical Israel, which pursued righteousness by works, found themselves unrighteous. And they are therefore the vessels of wrath. That is the point that Paul is making in Romans 9. This is the election. He says you can be a part of spiritual Israel. You can be a part of the vessels of mercy, but you have to pursue it by faith. There's certainly plenty of application there for us. Maybe we even sometimes delude ourselves in the same kind of mindset as physical Israel. You know, I'm part of the right church. I have the right doctrine. Of course I'm okay. Of course I'm saved. Are you pursuing righteousness by faith, or are you pursuing righteousness by a law? You better be pursuing righteousness by faith. There's also an interesting parallel here. Who is the quotation in verse 33 about? It's about Jesus. Isaiah. And I think there's an analogy here to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Again, God gave Pharaoh a command that Pharaoh was not going to keep. He was not going to obey it. Why is it that Jesus was such a stumbling block to his own people? What was it more than anything that made him a stumbling block to his own people? He had broke their traditions. They accused him of breaking the law. Yeah, expectations. They expected a real king. He was a spiritual king. And I think it was Brother D that said, and he professed to be God. Which, by the way, Paul had already mentioned back in verse 5 of this chapter. That's the stumbling block. Why is it now that physical Israel finds themselves hardened against God? Because Christ came. God in the flesh came. And he was a stumbling block to them. They stumbled right over it. They would not and could not accept that Jesus is the Christ and that he is God in the flesh. We're going to look at chapter 10 starting on Wednesday. And I think this is significant too. Because even here, while this is where physical Israel was heading, Paul's going to make the point in chapter 10, but not all physical Israel. There are still Israelites who are saved, and more Israelites can be saved. More members of the physical nation of Israel can be saved. So that in and of itself argues once again against this idea of an unconditional election of who is saved and who is lost. No, Paul's going to go on to talk about how more of his own kinsmen could be saved, but that's going to depend on their acceptance of the gospel, and the gospel that details that Jesus is in fact the Christ. He is God, and we need to put our faith in him. Steve.
Well, you're going to get into this next week, but it's...
Well, I have finished, and I thought bells were supposed to ring by now, so please, just go ahead.
But they were ignorant of God's righteousness. They refused to submit to it, and therefore they established their own.
Yeah,
And in doing so, they sealed their fate as a nation.
absolutely. That is exactly what happened. Kenny and then, John.
You know, regarding Pharaoh's hardening of his heart and how other people appear to have been used in God's plan, whether it's Pilate or Herod or other figures that we read about. The fact that they were used in this way and exactly what that means and how that was done by God is not the same as their eternal destiny.
Right.
So I know we're trying to kind of get around the whole hardening of the heart issue because it's that authority thing to discuss. But even if God does in some way use men in that way, it's not, again, it's not their eternal destiny, and that's where his justice comes in.
Right.
It kind of reminds me of the nations that Israel destroyed. Other men, women, children, animals. That doesn't determine their eternal destiny.
Right.
God will make those decisions. Anyway.
No, and I think that's a good point, John, that what Paul has been dealing with primarily in Romans 9 is not God's choosing to salvation, it's choosing to service and what becomes of that. Now, that does then become a question of Israel's salvation And that's how Paul ends it with talking about the differences between the vessels of mercy and the vessels of wrath. But I agree with your point. Kenny?
I have a question, because the immediate context of Exodus 33 is really the conversation that we get the cleft of the rock song.
Right.
That I want to see your glory. And God says, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I want to see my back. But it seems like we have the glory of God in Jesus now. And then we're shown the glory and we just miss it. Is there some connection that you think is there? Because I think in one way we are forbidden, and in another way we just completely did not see it at all.
You have to think about that one. Yeah. Let's all stand here and watch me think. So Kenny is right. The quotation from Exodus 33:19 is God's response to Moses' request to see his glory. And so you would almost look at those words about how he'd have mercy to whom he has mercy as applying to Moses and not Israel as the nation, per se. Yeah. I like answering all my questions with maybe as well. That's definitely a possibility. And so there would be more of a contrast between Moses and Pharaoh, but then
Moses and the kids, and the children of Israel, kids of Israel.
Kids, children, yeah. No, that's an interesting. I'll have to give that a little more thought. In reading 33, Moses is central to this because he's the one who's, interceding for the people. But as we know from Moses himself, he's not a perfect intercessor. He's not courageous. He's not, able to truly approach God. And so God's statement that I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy, there is application to Moses, but there's also application to Israel because that's what he's just done. I've had mercy on them, and I've got a reason for it. Yeah. Ross?
Reading this, like if I
Seriously, what's happening with the bells? Oh, okay. There it is, first one. I misread that.
if I had a Calvinist belief and reading this, it would seem really demotivating, but yet I've met some really motivated Calvinists.
Yes.
What is going on?
That's a good question. And Ross is absolutely right. I do not mean to impugn the fervent zeal of any believer. I am 100% against the doctrine because I think it says of God things that are absolutely not true. But you're right. I have known Calvinists in my life, and they are fervent in zeal and desire to serve God and please God, and they do not take their doctrine of election and absolute salvation as any way of saying I don't have to do the will of God. They fully believe that I need to do the will of God and that I am going to do the will of God. So I don't. There's a disconnect in my mind there too, and I don't fully understand it, Ross. Yeah, Brother D.
Israel thought they were doing the will of God.
Yeah, they did. They absolutely did. Steve?
One of the 10 chapters. They had a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge.
Right.
They would travel land and sea to win one proselyte and then contend.
Yep, that's right. And there's, of course, warning for all of us there. And we'll talk about that when we get into Romans 10 on Wednesday night. Zeal is not the indicator. Zeal is important, but it's not the only. Joe and then
I think
Terry.
to put it in today's context too, that the vast majority of people today are hardened by the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, and for different reasons. I mean, there's always been reasons why people are hardened against the gospel, and there's all kinds of different issues that rise. Terry?
Just a verse to the zeal of Calvinists. 2 Peter 1:10 says, "Therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election, for if you practice these qualities, you will never fall."
Right.
So just because you think you're right with Christ right now, doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually hardened. You have to make sure you're kind of
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I agree with that, but there is still the, if you take Calvinism at its word, like you are either fully elected or you are fully condemned, and there's no gray area there. So there's still, right, yeah, agreed. Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. Give you a few extra minutes. Thank you for being so kind, and we will attempt to cover all of chapter 10 on Wednesday evening.